This is the road to Rivendell. It is an Unreal Engine environment that I built inspired by my love of Lord of the Rings. And in this video, I'm going to be teaching you how to make an environment exactly like this one. I'm going to be taking you through my process, all the steps I took to build this environment, all through planning, all of the assets and tools I used, and some tips and tricks I learned along the way, some new PCG workflows I'm testing, and I have some free gifts for you. Speaking of which, special thank you to LEARTES Studio, who sponsored this video and provided the 3D assets and some of the tools I used as a basis for building this environment. And we'll go into all that later in the video, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that without their support, I wouldn't have been able to spend so much time on this environment. When you jump into a project like this, I have found that one of the best ways to approach it is to come from a place of personal love. For me, this love of Lord of the Rings started at a young age. I read all the books. I lived in Lord of the Rings when I was younger. The fiction, the stories, the characters were all I thought about. And when the movies for Lord of the Rings came out, they completely blew my mind. What blew my mind even further, sucked it into a wormhole and deposited me in the creative world that I now live in, is watching the appendices for the Lord of the Rings, which came as part of the extended edition when you bought it as a DVD box set, which we used to do for movies. In this box was contained many discs worth of making of films, which covered all parts of the process, the design process, the writing process, the beautiful artwork and drawings and paintings and sculptures done by the art team and concepts that they used to develop the final film. It also covered how they actually made some of the props and the environments. For example, they hired a blacksmith to forge all of the weapons in Lord of the Rings, which there are a lot of. And they also covered all the miniature work when they built the environments. Everything from the Black Gates to Rivendell were all built as miniatures, and also it covered the 3D animation that went into bringing Lord of the Rings to life. I couldn't fathom the fact that you could use the computer to build completely new characters, new worlds, things you could only imagine, and they could become real and you could live in those worlds. This was something that I was just so enamored by. That really was the spark that sent me down the path towards being a professional 3D artist. If you're new, my name is THADDAEUS, and I've been a professional 3D artist now for over 10 years. I've worked on all kinds of projects, and now I teach thousands of people environment art through YouTube and my own online academy. If you're interested, you can find a link to that in the description. But back to planning this environment, the first thing that really helps me start to think about what I want to build, I usually starts with reference. What I mean by reference are images and videos that you gather into one place, put them out on the wall, or in my case, I use a software called PureRef to lay out all my references, and this helps you organize ideas. You can also make a Pinterest board. It doesn't really matter, but the point is that you're gathering references, and those references will spark ideas for other things, which you can gather references for, and as you continue to gather these references, you can help to form your ideas and give them shape. From the references, we get to concept. Now, this is where you take your references and you coalesce them into what you actually want to build. This can still be pretty loose. For me, it was this idea of the road to Rivendell. Rivendell is such an iconic location from Lord of the Rings, but I thought it would be really cool to zero in on a particular area of Rivendell, in this case, the road leading up to Rivendell as you enter this kind of ravine that Rivendell is situated in, and there's this beautiful winding path that leads up to Elrond's house. I thought it gave a lot of opportunity for interesting things to build, like a vision of Rivendell in the distance as you're walking, also little areas along the road that you could stop. So we have this kind of blending of wild woods into this location of Rivendell. So it's really a good idea to not overcomplicate or expand the scope too far, especially in the build in the beginning. It's much better to keep it small, and that way you can add a lot more detail in before you expand it too large of an area. And so I started with a much larger area here. You can see I'm starting to block out the world, but I gradually kind of contracted it down till it was something that I felt like I could achieve in a reasonable amount of time. I've seen many students' projects just kind of sort of fizzle out because they've tried to build too large of an area, and what they really just needed to do is shrink down and maybe build 1/4 of that or one little section, but really build it to a high quality. And it's really important, especially early on, that you have a really high frequency of projects. Each new project you learn something new on. I know for this project, I learned a whole bunch of new things, some new workflows, some new kind of tips and tricks that I'm going to take with me into the next project. And if your project is just like 2 years long or something like that, you kind of extend the timeline of learning. Actually, I've found that if you do a bunch of shorter projects, of smaller scope projects in a row, you learn much faster and much more than if you just had one long project. And this isn't always possible. Sometimes we're working on environments for games or much larger projects, but if you have a choice, I think it's really nice to narrow it down so you can really get the most out of it. So we have our reference, then our concept, then our assets. At the point where I was working on my concept, I was also looking at other asset packs and things out there that were available that I could use to build what I wanted to build. So it was a kind of a push and pull of what I was excited to build and what are assets easily available. In my case, I was looking around on LEARTES' own asset library, and I discovered this really awesome asset pack by Stefan van der Sant. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. This beautiful elven city and woods. It really sparked my imagination and kind of fit really well with one of the Lord of the Rings environments that I was looking at, which was Rivendell. Now that I had my core asset pack, which doesn't always have to be one pack. In fact, I brought in a lot of other LEARTES assets as I was working. You know, having a good starting point, at least knowing that you can build out most of your starting assets with a good pack can sometimes save you a lot of time. So I had my reference, my concept, and my assets, and so I was ready to start blocking in my environment. Many students in my academy actually have a difficult time taking the leap from their concept, their reference, and their assets to planning and laying out an environment. It's deceptively simple. Obviously, you think you put some assets down and then you're good, but a lot more goes into crafting a really interesting and intricate world. It's not just assets. There's a lot of thought that goes into where everything is placed, the elevation of things, the size of things, the story of how you move through the space, how it feels when you explore. These are all things that are a little difficult to quantify, and so I want to give you a few tips here to help lay out this environment. The first thing is to stay super simple at first. I just created my landscape here. I used a basic height map for a mountain and I inverted it to create a little gorge area, and I just dragged in one of the preset blueprints from my Elven City asset pack to be the building of Rivendell in the distance, and then I just kind of started using simple shapes to block out where maybe the road could be and maybe where the kind of overlook could be, where you see Rivendell in the background, which is something I knew I really wanted to capture. I started to really build out all of these different little areas, and this is really an opportunity to experiment. You want to place some things down, you want to drop into your character, a third person or first person character, and run around in the space, get a feeling for how big everything is, how interesting it will be to kind of come around the corner and see Rivendell in the background, and you'll start to get ideas too. You keep looking back at your reference, different kinds of structures you could have, you keep looking back at your level, you start moving things around. I think a tip for you when you're doing this yourself, this is not the only way to do it, but for me what really helped is to think about just connecting the dots. In this level, I had a particular set of locations that I definitely wanted to have. The stairs coming down into this pathway area that leads to Rivendell. Small pool with a statue, which you can see here is based on one of the reference images that I got. I imagine this would be somewhere somebody could sit and rest on their way. I wanted a overlook that you come to that reveals the mountains and Rivendell nestled into the trees. And I kind of also wanted to have a sequence of arches that led you through the space. These are just things I came to as I was looking at my reference. I started to identify these are a few elements I'd like to have in my environment. Then I took those and I plopped them down and I rearranged them, and when I had them all kind of in the right distance from each other and roughly where I thought they should be, all I did was just connect the dots. What would be in between these spaces? There would be a path that goes this way through the trees, then maybe you have a fork that comes over here to the pool area, then behind the pool maybe there's some sort of a little glen. You know, you just start to fill in the gaps, and this is a lot easier of a way to approach laying out a level than just doing everything all at once. It's better to just start with the things that you know you want to have there and just, like I said, connect the dots. And drilling deeper into that idea, I think the one thing that I really wanted to capture in this particular environment here was to have little, I'm going to call them moments, little pools of light, little collections of things that you could walk up to and really observe and kind of existed as little points of interest throughout my environment. That could be a lot of things. This kind of statue with vines, this light coming down on it could be one of them. It could be also a little clump of flowers and plants that has grown out of the corner of this stone structure. It could be, of course, the overlook where you see Rivendell in the background, but the more of these little pockets and pools of interest that I can build into the space, the more it will feel like something that you want to explore. When we explore environments in games, we don't really want them to just all feel the same. We want to have this feeling like around the next corner, behind that rock, behind this structure, there might be something interesting, because we start to teach ourselves, or we teach the player, that when you do go and look, you'll find maybe it's not a chest, but it's some interesting story element, or it's some beautiful little vista, or it's something that helps people feel like the more that they explore, the more that they will see. And this just really also helps to create a nice layered, dense, and alive feeling world. So since LEARTES Studios was kind enough to sponsor this tutorial, I wanted to use one of their many awesome asset packs as the basis for the environment. And they have a ton of really great high quality asset packs on their store, which is called Cosmos. And it's very similar to Fab in that you can download a plugin called Rocket, which basically is the same as the Fab plugin. I would say the differentiator here is that Fab kind of gives you access to everything and many different sellers, many different levels of quality, and some you've probably discovered at some point that some of the assets work with Unreal Engine, some don't. And Cosmos has a very different approach. What they're doing is creating a very curated, high quality list of environment packs, also individual assets and visual effects and sound. They're giving you fewer, more curated options. But I mean, that being said, they have, it must be 100 different environments of very different styles, you know, medieval environment packs and stylized ones and realistic ones and sci-fi environments. And the thing you can kind of expect is that they have all come through the LEARTES Studio team, and it's either been built by LEARTES Studio or they've actually contracted an environment artist in the community to build it, which I think is super cool and is a great way of just employing people in the community, adding to this awesome library of assets. So the Cosmos store acts exactly like Fab in that you can download a plugin called Rocket, install it to your engine just as you would any other plugin, and then you can access it as a button in your content browser here. So I can click on it and I can access all these assets directly from my content browser, and which is awesome, you can just go ahead and drag the assets in directly into your level, which I did constantly. Obviously, I downloaded the Elven environment, which if you download a full environment, it downloads as a full Unreal Engine project. But I also wanted to use individual assets like a tree that I was missing. And so I would go in and drag in a new tree or a new bush or vines, whatever I needed. And that was just really efficient and worked really well. And I'm dragging in like nanite level assets here. So sometimes I would get a moment of download as it was updating in my project. But besides that, I didn't run into any hitches. And if you already have assets downloaded, then it's basically an instant process of just dragging it into your level, which is great. If you'd like to try Cosmos out, there are a bunch of free assets here that you could just jump on and try out. But if you'd like to go ahead and jump on a subscription for Cosmos, I have a link in the description that will give you 50% off. So I found this tool really useful, so hopefully you do as well. They also very often offer really big bundles of environments, probably the most packed bundles with the highest value that I've seen anybody offer. So just to review, so far we've gotten reference, concept, and assets as my planning phase, and then we come to connecting the dots, blocking, and moments as sort of my three main concepts I was thinking about while laying out the general placement of things in my level. That brings me to the building phase. So when you get to this phase, there's lots of different ways of approaching this. There's not just one way. The way I found was useful to me in this case was to first deal with my landscape materials first, which in this case I used my Aziel Arts landscape material, which is both an auto material and with paintable landscape layers. It supports nanite displacement and landscape grass, even on auto snow, auto beach functions. It's It's a really great fully featured tool. If you'd like to use this material on your own projects, I am giving it away for free, and you can find a link to that below in the description, along with a course on all the features and how to get the best out of them. So I use this as a starting point, and I started to paint in the different areas of grass and rocks, and this also helped me further plan, where I would want my paths to be. And then I started dragging in assets. Now, when you're putting your assets into your world, this step is really easy to get caught up in the details. What I mean by that is really easy to start obsessing over little areas of grass or little small structures or little details of weathering and things like that. And you really have to try to make yourself just focus on the biggest shapes first and then work down. So for me, that was blocking out the main bridge structure, the main overlook area here, the path that leads through the big stone pool with a statue. I really needed to hold myself back from, jumping in and painting plants everywhere and things. Because if you do this, it's counterintuitive. You'll think you'll arrive at a denser world, but you'll end up with something that feels weirdly empty. So big down to small, it's such a huge concept, and actually very difficult to stick to. Even for myself, I've built many environments, and always something I have to consciously tell myself to stop, jumping in and wanting to paint little details and just sticking to the big structures. To that end, assemblies are basically collections of PCG points that have a mesh assigned to them already. You basically start with a level filled with meshes, and you bake that into PCG points, and then that can be read as individual little PCG clumps in your world, and you can either place those randomly, or in my case, I wanted to hand place them because I wanted to have this mix of some parts of my level being hand placed and beautifully crafted, and other parts to be procedurally generated, like the surrounding forest and a larger area. So I wanted to kind of have the best of both worlds, but I did want to also still use the efficiency of PCG, the fact that it spawns all the meshes as hierarchical instance static meshes, and I wanted a lot of density, so I elected to use a hybrid method where I created an empty blueprint with this that only contained the collision mesh for the assembly. And once I created that, I could go ahead and drag that blueprint into my world, and then my larger PCG graph would go ahead and pick up all the locations where I'd placed those blueprints, and it would go ahead and spawn the assembly. And I didn't use a lot of assemblies for this environment. I actually used only 3 assemblies for this whole level. That was this one rock assembly here that I used along the riverbed, and basically kind of all the edges of things. And then I have this second assembly that's basically a tree with a bunch of plants around it, with also vines hanging off of the tree. I added additional meshes and things into that. And the third assembly was these arches, and I just spent a lot of time making a single beautiful arch, and then I just used some of the randomization that comes with PCG to spawn random assortments of things on them. The cool thing about using just one assembly is that I can fill out an area very quickly, and I can still in my PCG graph add some randomization to each assembly that I put down. In the case of the tree assembly, I could have the grass and rocks project down onto the landscape wherever I place that assembly, so that they're never sticking up even if I angle the tree or whatever. And for the rocks, I could spawn a random assortment of grass or plants so they never quite look the same. It really gives you a lot of randomization flexibility. But those of you who have used PCG before, the only issue is that we want to spawn as many PCG meshes as we can without collision. So I elected to spawn my assemblies without collision, and those empty blueprints I placed down, I actually put a simplified collision mesh into a single mesh that was basically a voxel wrap mesh of the entire PCG assembly. So it's one single mesh, it's very efficient. And so I was able to put that into each dummy blueprint that I placed into my world. And this also gave me a little bit of flexibility when I was positioning things, because your PCG graph will update and spawn things only after you finished moving your objects. And so this let me have a visual for where I was placing these assemblies, and then as soon as I stopped moving it, the assemblies would snap in. I could get the best of both worlds, a creatively hand-placed sequence of assemblies, but they were all spawning through a single PCG graph, and therefore very efficient and dense. Once I blocked out most of my world with these hand-placed assemblies, then I just built a simple PCG graph for spawning the trees, and I used a spline to cut out the area that I had been working on with a difference node, so that I had my kind of crafted area, and then I had my procedurally generated area. Next, I went in with actually hand painted foliage. This is the process of just taking some meshes and dragging it into your foliage painter, creating foliage assets for those. And this is how I added in additional vines and grass and small piles of rocks and leaves. This is where the environment really started to feel old and weathered. But I think a really good tip here is to really try to be intentional. Whenever you put the brush stroke down, there should be a reason that that brush stroke is there. Think about how the leaves, for example, are falling from the tree, and so they would probably show up in an area near the tree. And the more we paint the leaves, not just generally everywhere, but maybe generally everywhere, but much more in higher density amounts directly around the bottoms of trees, or maybe where they blew to from trees, that really helps the environment feel more real. Another example is the growth of vines. Don't just randomly spread vines throughout your world. You want to have a real thought process for where the vines grew from. So if they grew from the ground and then up and then wrapped around a structure, you want to be able to very quickly visually chart where the vines grew from, the older area of vines and the younger area of vines that are a little sparser. Everything has a story and a way that it grew into the space. We're not trying to just randomly spread things. This is where the art part comes in. You need to be able to look at your reference, at the real natural world, and translate that into your environments. This is the case for any type of art. It comes from a place of observation, and it comes from a place of observing color or shape or the ways that things grow. It comes from how we see, how closely we see the world around us, and how we translate that either into something that's a direct copy or our own creative permutation. Everything starts from a place of realism, even if it is stylized. The better you can get at looking closely at your reference and looking closely at how things are growing, the dirt is collecting in crevices, where the scratches on things are and where the weathering is, the closer that you can look at those things and really start to internalize them, the better you can get at translating that and doing that in your environments. And the more you do that and the more you add those details intentionally, I guarantee you will see a huge jump in quality in your environments. And the last step, of course, was lighting. I spent some time angling the sun and finding good angles that illuminated pools of lights in areas in my level that looked interesting and helped draw you through the space. And then I also actually did a little bit of work of adding additional lights, always thinking from a place of how this lighting would be motivated. So for example, I have this lighting on the statue here in order to help intensify the effect. I could see that the sun was falling through the trees here and illuminating the statue, and so I thought, well, maybe if I could add an additional spotlight, in this case behind the head of the statue, I could add an extra glow, create more of a moment in this area with my lighting. And so when you're approaching your levels, just start from a place of realism first. Try to make sure your sun's in the right location. Try to make sure your fog is dialed in from a good place of realism. And then you can go in and start to push and pull it in good creative directions. Think about, all right, I want to draw somebody's eye here. You can draw somebody's eyes just to a certain place with contrast. So if I have an area of bright after an area of dark, your eyes obviously going to go to that bright area. And so in your space, you can think of light and dark and how you can create contrast in the areas that you want people to look at. If you use something like the ultra dynamic sky, you get to a very high level of fidelity really quickly. So that's always a help, but then you'll always need to go ahead and tweak the intensity of your sun, the level of fog, the level of sun rays contributing to your volumetric. For example, I want to have really strong light rays falling through the trees. So I like to boost the sun's contribution to the volumetric fog in my environment, which helped achieve that effect. And again, I'm always coming back to my reference and looking for things I can draw out of them and translate them into my world. If you're ever not sure about how to push something in further, it means you just need to step back, look at more reference, look for things that you like that inspire you, details, things people have done in their own renders or the real world, photographs of real environments. Just look for things that draw you to them, and then think about how you could do that same thing in your environment. If you ever feel stuck, just go back to your reference. All right, so that is my process. Just to review, the steps that we take here are: first, your inspiration and your story come from a place of personal love. Then gather reference, take that reference and form it into a concept for a real place. Look at the assets available or what assets you'd like to build yourself and find a good location that works with both of them. Then you jump into planning the space. This can look like blocking out things with simple shapes, finding the dots, the points of interest in your world that you need to have, where they should be in relationship to each other, and then just connecting the dots. And we want to create little moments and pockets of interest throughout our environment. Finally, we have lighting, where we want to draw the eye of the viewer or the player to the focus that we want them to look at, and we do this through contrast. So these are the steps. Of course, we could go deeper on all of those steps, and there's other concepts we could draw in to help build our environments. But if you follow that process all the way through, you will come up with an environment that you're proud of. I'm sure of it. Hopefully you found some of these tips and tricks along the way useful in your own environment building. A special thank you again to LEARTES Studio and their tool Cosmos for sponsoring this video and providing me with these awesome assets and tools. You can find a link to use Cosmos yourself, as well as a 50% discount in the link in the description. Enjoy. This is just one set of tools that you can use, and I used and sped up my workflow. Of course, you don't have to use Cosmos. You could use Fab or any of the other asset libraries out there, but what matters is that you follow through with these steps and build the environments that you're passionate about. If you'd like to go deeper with me on learning any of these concepts, either working one-on-one or just checking out my courses or some of my tools and other things I used here, you can find all of that stuff in Asial Arts Academy, and there's a link to that in the description. With that, I will see you in the next one.